allies, we've won some great advances in recent years, gaining improvements in people's health, access to health, education, and economic opportunities. Many of you have heard me speak really proudly about these several times before, but I'm going to do it again. The £1.1 billion for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, pledged by the UK government in 2016. The £100 million they pledged in 2017 to help fund the final push to eradicate polio from our planet, and the £225 million pledged just last month to the Global Partnership for Education. Though we'd liked for some of these pledges to be bigger to meet the level of need. But as experienced campaigners know, these pledges didn't just happen. They happened because people like you told politicians that this is what we wanted our government to do, and that these arguments carried weight. That weight is what we refer to as the political will to tackle poverty. And the political will also doesn't generate itself. It's part of that dialogue between individuals and groups in society, and as such, it's fluid and it can be influenced. And that's our role as advocates. The regular flow of scare stories in the news over the last year about wasted or misspent aid is evidence that we can't stop sharing the truth about the progress that's being made in the fight against extreme poverty. Because if people aren't told about what UK aid achieves, they're going to quite understandably believe that what is presented them on television sets and in the newspaper, and of course with the news media always highlighting the bad news, the heart-wrenching human drama and the scandals. So without a constant effort to create the political will for the public goods that we believe in, there are plenty of forces that could all too easily turn our political leaders' attention to other priorities. So we've got to help keeping the public to understand what's being achieved and help them feel proud to carry on supporting this vital work. It's an ongoing and important task that we at Results have taken upon ourselves to undertake. And I hope that you feel as proud as I am to be part of that mission. But now to something we sadly can't be proud of at all. I'm sure you were as disappointed and horrified as I was over the last few weeks to hear stories about what can happen when aid efforts go wrong. In this case, when a few humanitarian workers engaged in sexual misconduct and possibly criminal offences, taking advantage of vulnerable women in the very communities they were there to help. Quite rightly, the newspapers exposed this scandal, and we've seen the Charity Commission, the government and Parliament act very swiftly to force the charities involved to take responsibility for their failures to stop these abuses, and to ask the entire sector to look again at our whistleblowing and safeguarding policies. This is absolutely right. We can't be complacent and assume that because we are organisations which are trying to do good things in the world, we're somehow immune from the darker side of human nature. As the story developed, I was also incredibly disappointed to hear about senior, powerful male leaders in a big, well-known NGOs who've behaved inappropriately with more junior female staff, and others who, instead of acting firmly to deal with serious abuses of power, put the reputations of their organisations before the need to take proper action. If anything good comes of these occurrences, it's going to be that international development NGOs have been forced to look at our own policies and practices to ensure that we do the best that we can to put our values into practice internally to ensure abuse doesn't happen, and that if it ever does, to root it out. Be assured that the staff, management, and board of trustees at Results have all been very clear that, like other organisations in our sector, we must double check that we have strong policies in place to safeguard our staff, volunteers, and the people that we work with. We're actively doing that now. You've probably heard the arguments that elements of the media have used these scandals as a way of discrediting NGOs and to support their story that aid isn't working more broadly. While this is almost certainly an unfair take on the sector as a whole, we have to be very careful to not in any way minimise or be in denial about the abuses that have occurred, and we can't even appear to be. We must be transparent, open, and ready to improve. It's a tragedy that negative stories are overshadowing the good work that's being done day in, day out to achieve the global goals. But if we want to be people who live our values, we need to hold ourselves to high standards, and we need to actively choose to be leaders in improving ourselves and the societies that we're in. We can't be defensive or self-serving if we're going to succeed in this mission. Now, I know these are really sensitive topics that some people find hard to discuss. Some people watching the recent stories will have experienced abuses of power of various sorts themselves, We saw from the Me Too hashtag just how prevalent this is across all of society. And while we have no reason to think there are specific issues in Results UK, if anyone has any concerns in relation to results that they want to raise in confidence, or if they've come across anything they don't think is quite right, I want to say that I really hope people will feel able to bring it into us in whatever way they feel is most appropriate. Now, I'd like to suggest we move on to more positive topics and hear about the great work that you guys and your network has been doing around the country. So I'm going to hand over to Hannah to provide a roundup, and I think we'll also hear from Naveed and from some of you.
Cool. Thank you, Aaron, and hello from the Results Office, where I'm with the London group this evening. Firstly, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who took the March action on transition, which was to write the new permanent secretary at DFID, Matthew Rycroft, on transition, which is our new campaign. We know that he's received letters from at least 6 different groups. Brighton, Edinburgh, Sheffield, Macclesfield, Linlithgow and Stort Valley at least, which is great. We've been really impressed by all the letters that we've seen, and they've all taken a really different and personal angle. So well done, and thank you to everyone who's been able to take action. We're sure that thanks to your letters and emails, transition is now firmly on his radar. In fact, he even liked a tweet from Jill, our campaigner in the Stort Valley group, about our transition campaign. So as always, we'll share any further updates and any responses that we receive with you in the next call. We know that transition might seem like quite a complicated topic to explain and campaign on, but we hope that many of you are now getting to grips with the topic. I'd really recommend taking a look at the recent blog written by the Brighton group. This was written by Thomas Bell, and it's a fantastic example of how to communicate this issue in a really accessible and interesting way. I will post a link to this in the chat box later on. Here in London, the London group have been busy doing some crafty campaigning again, and I'm going to ask Aisling to tell you some more about it and tell you what they got up to.
Thank you. We had a Prism event about 2 weeks ago now. It was a really, really good event, so we basically all got around. We had this amazing venue filled with every kind of crafting supply that you can imagine, and everyone made very different things, with the ultimate goal being to send it to politicians. So most of us tried to keep it within the results kind of campaigns, so transition and TB were a big theme of a lot of the crafts, but we also had some new members who were sort of attracted about something quite different, and they sort of did crafts on their own kind of personal passions. So there were things about gender and things like FGM. It was a really good way of getting people sort of interested, and a good sort of, it's always billed as the introvert's way to do activism. So it's a really nice event. I definitely recommend it to anyone else in any of your groups.
Great, thank you.
And a blog. Oh yes, we also wrote a blog post. So, if anyone wants to follow the London group on Twitter or Facebook, you can find our blog. It's really good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sounds a really exciting event. I'm looking forward to hearing if you get any replies. I'll post the link to their blog in the chat box as well, so you can have a look at some of the things they made. Finally, I know that some of you are busy preparing for World TB Day. We've heard that the Birmingham group are planning to talk to people at a local running event, and I believe that Brighton and London are also busy planning events, so I will share some updates on that in the next call, and we're looking forward to seeing how things go. Good luck to anyone else who's planning an event and who's also planning to meet your MP. We'll hear more from Rosanna later about why 2018 is the year to tackle TB. And as always, do get in touch with the office if you'd like any support with any of the actions. So before I finish tonight's update, does anybody else have anything they'd like to share from the last month? No? Okay. Well, before we go back to Aaron, we've got a couple of events we want to mention, so I'm just going to ask Naveed to tell you about those quickly. Thank you.
Hi, back to me again. So thanks, Hannah. Hello, everyone. I'd just like to put a plug in for the Results National Conference, which some of you know about. It's on the 2nd to the 4th of June this year at the NCVO building in London. If you're on the email list, which I know most of you are, you'll have received an email with a link to where you can book your place. Prices are between £12 and £15, depending on how long you come for, and we hope to see lots of you there. So do dig out that email, or you can simply visit the events section of the results website, and we'll be sending out our monthly news flash in a couple of days, and that will also include a link. So plenty of ways of finding out about that. It might seem a long way off, but it's really helpful for us to have bookings early and know about numbers. The theme of the conference, it a bit follows on from last year, which some of you will know about. We talked about at a time of kind of rising division and national self-interest and global insecurity, how advocacy on these issues matters more than ever. And this year we're going to sort of go back to that idea, but look at practically how we can try to come together to if you like, join the dots, we're calling it, to form the movement that will be needed to develop that political will Aaron was talking about to end extreme poverty by 2030. And we'll be having a usual advocacy day on the Monday, that's the 4th, where we'll meet civil servants and politicians and tell them what we care about and find out from them how best we can achieve the goals that we have together. Does anyone have any questions about the national conference?
Do we have any speakers?
I knew someone was going to ask me that. We have no confirmed speakers yet, but we'll be putting details up on the Eventbrite as soon as we know. Lastly, Hannah is the person to bribe if you want a particularly fine lunch. So you comments to her later. So lastly, I just wanted to mention the Results International Conference, which is between the 14th and the 17th of July in Washington, D.C. It's an incredibly inspiring event, as I discovered last year, and it's a chance to meet passionate advocates from around the world and just be part of that, that global movement we've just been talking about. I would really recommend it. We have a small number of bursaries of around £500 per person to go towards the cost of attending, which is on a first-come, first-served basis. Again, you'll find details on the event section of our website, but do have a chat with me if you want to know a little bit more about that event. So that's all from me, and now I think back to Aaron.
And Aaron gets himself unmuted. Right. So thank you very much, Hannah and Naveed. It's time to talk a little bit about the topic of tonight's call, which is related to the really set of really important opportunities, and one in particular that we have to address tuberculosis in 2018. For those of you that are new to results, tuberculosis is the world's deadliest killer disease. For those of you that have been around for a while, you're probably very familiar with TB. As many of you know, this is a topic very close to my own heart. I'm quite deeply engaged in this work. Later on this week, I'm off to India to meet with people around this issue. The Indian government is doing some exciting things. We're seeing lots of interesting movement there. But tonight, we're here to learn from somebody outside of results. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. This is Rosanna Fleury. She's the Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia at the Global TB Caucus Secretariat. She works with members of the Eurasian Parliamentary Group on TB to help them maximise their impact on addressing TB at the national and regional level, and leads the work of the Global TB Caucus on the G20. Rosanna, I know you're on the call because I can see you, and I've got your warning that your internet is a bit rough, so hopefully it will hold up. But thank you very much for joining us on the call this evening. Let me just introduce to you who we've got on the call. We're joined tonight by volunteer campaigners from all over the UK. You can see their lovely smiling faces on the video chat and some of the locations where they're from. There are people on this call with varying levels of experience, from brand new to old hands, but they're all united by a passion for taking action to overcome global poverty. We've got campaigners from Poole to Edinburgh, going to be fascinated by what you have to say, and more importantly, everybody here is really keen and ready to take some concrete advocacy actions in support of the fight against TB. We've, just so you know what's coming at you, we've got 4 pre-arranged questions, one more than normal, but then we're going to open up the floor. For those of you that are on your computers, feel free to ask a question using the chat function on the side of your screen. For those of you on the phones, you can text them in if you prefer not to ask them verbally, as always. The number for text this evening is 0777 56 11178. That's 0777 56 11178. 78. We'll pop that in the chat box in just a second so you see it written down. But before we go to those questions, Rosanna, I'd like to ask you to say a little bit about yourself. Can you describe the role that you perform and a little bit about your personal motivation? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What drives you to do the work that you do?
Okay, thank you. Can I just double check that everybody can hear me and see me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm glad. Thanks so much for having me on the call. It's been a bit last minute. I know I wasn't the one you were supposed to have, but I'm very happy to be here talking to you all. I imagine that probably some of you have heard a little bit about the Global TB Caucus, but I'm not sure how much all of you know. So I'll give just a quick overview of who we are and what we do. So as Aaron said, I'm the regional lead for Europe and Central Asia at the Global TB Caucus. So I work with about 250 MPs, I think it is at the moment, across the region, in the Western European countries, but also in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So it's quite a few countries in the portfolio, and I also lead the work that we're doing around the G20, which we will probably come to a little bit later in the discussions, I imagine. I am external, but just to note that Results UK very kindly host us in their office. There's just a few of us there, and then I have some colleagues around the world in the different regions working with the MPs in their relevant regions, and together we support around 2,500 MPs. So the way that the caucus works, or the way that the MPs work, is at different levels. So they work at the national level, the regional and the global, and they use the unique tools that they have available to them as parliamentarians to drive forward work on TB. I know you've probably all seen how it works in action with the UK APPG on TB, and the global co-chair, Nick Herbert, is he's the co-chair of our global network as well as the UK APPG, along with the Minister of Health of South Africa, who is called Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi. And we have leading MPs in each of the regions who form the governance of the network. So it really is an MP-led network. At the Secretariat, we draft a lot of speaking notes and send a lot of gentle reminders, but the MPs really do work closely with us and decide our strategy and what we focus on. I think there's two aspects that are key to mention with how we try and work with the MPs. One is sustainability, and the other one is shaping the international agenda. So with regards to sustainability, what we try and do is facilitate connections between members of parliament in the countries that we work in, between them and national and local civil society, that continue to work with them in the same way that Results UK does with the UK PPG, to make sure that there's country level support there, and long-term relationships are built with the MPs, so that if we were to drop off the face of the planet, that work would continue. And then with regards to the international agenda, we work with obviously MPs have access to platforms that us as regular people don't have access to necessarily, and can really help amplify the voice amplify the position of the TB, the issue of TB in kind of global platforms. So that's a bit about the Global TB Caucus. I wasn't expecting a question about my personal motivation, but I think it's fair to say that I've always been interested in working in international development, probably for many of the same reasons that you all are interested in it. And I kind of fell into TB by accident, but I'm very glad that I did. I think it sounds a bit strange, but people that work in TB often say they kind of fall in love with it and form a loyalty to it, because as we all know, it's very neglected in comparison to other issues. So I'll stop there, and I'll hand back over to Aaron or whoever, and if anyone has any questions about the just let me know.
Thanks so much, Rosanna. Great for sharing your personal motivations as well. We're going to go straight over into the questions. So please, folks, remember to introduce yourself before asking them. We're going to go across to Paul for the very first one.
Hello, I'm Helen from Poole, and I've been working with Results for many, many years, and on TB for most of those years. So I wonder, why 2018 is going to be such an important. Is this any different from the last, say, 20 years?
Thank you, Helen. If you've been working with results for many, many years, you probably know, you probably are more familiar with it all than I am. But yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important question, and I think it's very fair to ask what's so different about 2018 in comparison to other years. We know there have been previous political declarations on TB and efforts made. So I think what's different about 2018 is a very fair question. So I know you've all heard, because I know you've been writing to your MP about it, that we have the United Nations high-level meeting for TB this year. And we also have potentially an opportunity within the G20 agenda to get TB in there as well. They're two important events. Obviously, the HLM is very important. It's the first time that heads of state have ever, from across the world, have ever met to discuss TB. So I hope I can just give a bit of background and just explain this in context. So obviously, we know that TB is one of the world's oldest killers, and it's the world's deadliest infectious disease. And as I said before, it's relatively neglected in comparison to other issues. And what we always hear, I'm sure you've all heard it, and we as people that work in TB hear it all the time, that political awareness and political will is actually acknowledged as pretty lacking for TB, and that hinders the response to the disease globally. So, we haven't had a global response like we've seen it in HIV. Much of the TB response has been national and regional priorities. And of course, while this is, can you all still hear me? Sorry, I'm being told I've been logged out.
No, we can. I just think somebody's not muted. I don't know who is the boss of the recording. If they could pop other folks on mute, that would be great.
Sorted? Okay, cool. I can't hear stuff anymore, so I imagine the muting has worked. Yeah, sorry, where was I? Yeah, so a lot of attention's been focused on national and regional priorities, and obviously that's important. But we know that global momentum can really help accelerate progress, and obviously getting to higher and higher levels of decision makers can also do the same thing. So basically 2018 seems to be a year where the global community is finally starting to come together for TB. We've had a lot of important moments leading up to this. I think it's fair to kind of look back a bit. I think since the SDGs, obviously it's not very far back, it's only a couple of years, but since the SDGs were decided in 2015, the global communities had a mandate to actually end the epidemic. Although the MDGs, so the Millennium Development Goals, did aim to reverse trends and incidents, so reduce the rates of TB, which saved a lot of lives. The SDGs actually target the end of TB. Although at the current rate of progress, we're looking to miss that target by about 180 years. So there's lots to do. So we've also had the TB epidemic gaining traction in the G20 over the last 2 or 3 years. It was referenced last year in the G20 leaders communique, which is the main political declaration that comes out of that. And I think the reason we want the G20 to act on it is because they're the world's richest countries, and they hold about half the world's TB burden. So they have the capacity to really address their own burdens and take down the global burden of TB, but also to invest in TB R&D and new tools to actually treat the disease and diagnose it, which is really needed, as you know. A fact for you that some people don't know, and I'm bound to say it because I work in mostly in Europe and Central Asia, but the European region actually has the fastest growing drug-resistant TB epidemic in the world. And so it's something that we really need to act on, and that angle of drug-resistant TB seems to be one that does gain some political traction. And then also last year we had the Moscow Ministerial Conference, which was where ministers of health came together in Russia, in Moscow, in November last year, to decide on what the priority should be for some of the priority should be for the high level meeting and lay the foundations for it, and then agree on how to take it to the highest levels of government, so heads of state. So to round it off, we have the high level meeting in September, which will be historic really in the discussion of the TB response at that level of heads of state and heads of government. So I'll stop rambling there. I don't know if anybody has any questions.
Ooh, right, sorry, no, that's me. Thanks so much for that, Rosanna. I think that's a great lead-in to why 2018 is really shaping up to be quite a pivotal moment after a lot of work. Some things that have never happened before are happening for the first time, which is just really, really exciting. We're going to go across to Birmingham for question number 2.
Hiya, my name's Savannah, calling from Birmingham. For me, on the other hand, this is only my second week with the group. But our question basically is, what needs to happen at the UN high-level meeting on TB to improve the lives and chances of people currently on treatment for the disease?
Hi, Savannah. Thanks for the question, and welcome to the Results Network. I hope that you like it and you stick around. What needs to happen at the UN high-level meeting? I think it's kind of there's the UN high-level meeting itself on the 26th of September, which is obviously a day where heads of state will come together. There will also be obviously other representatives in country delegations, civil society, different stakeholders, possibly some ministers, etc. But then there's the before from the meeting. There's the meeting itself, and then there's the after. So I think that it kind of makes sense to break down that question into those different periods of time. I think in the lead up to the meeting, which is going to be which will be very important. Obviously, the follow up is the most important thing, of course, because we need to make sure that the targets that are all grandly set out actually get met. But before the meeting, I think one of the most important things, of course, is that heads of state actually need to commit to go. I know that you're all. I know that some of you have been working maybe already or will possibly be doing so to try and encourage this from Theresa May. Well, that remains to be seen. But I think, especially in countries where there's high burdens of TB as well, it's very important that the heads of state or the highest level representatives actually attend. I think in the lead up to the meeting, the TB community needs to work together to coordinate on what the asks are. One of which will be around, I imagine, stepping up domestic financing of TB, especially in so countries funding their own TB responses, especially in the view of middle income countries who have previously been eligible for international assistance from big global organisations with regards to their TB response. Once they start to get a bit richer, they lose that help, and then there's gaps in their TB responses. I know that some of you have been writing to your MPs about this issue, which we know as transition, so I think you're very well briefed on that. So that issue and a lot of others, around improving TB policies and implementing national strategies and making sure that they're actually funded, because it's all very well having a plan, but if there's no money behind it and it can't be implemented, then it can't actually reach those people who are currently on treatment. So I think we need to work with all of the decision makers involved. In the lead up to the meeting, with all the different stakeholders, so that the actual asks for the meeting are well thought through, and ultimately reach everybody that needs to be reached. I think governments and ministries and MPs need to be fully sensitised to and made aware of the TB epidemic and got on side. So we all need we need everyone who has a role to play in the negotiations to be aware of the magnitude of the global TB epidemic. And I know that, well, from my own experience, I know that a lot of decision makers aren't, because people are often still surprised when we tell them how much of a problem it is. And I think that me and my role and you guys in how you work with results have some important parts to play in that. So I think, yeah, we need to convince the people that have the power that it's worth acting on. I think there's a big economic argument to tackle TB. I think for return on investment, it's something like for every dollar that you spend on investing in the TB response, you get 80 back. When TB becomes drug resistant, it becomes super expensive to treat the disease. It can be up to 450 times more expensive, which is just a crazy burden on countries' health systems that obviously just doesn't need to be there. So I think that's an argument we can use. At the meeting itself, I think it's very important, obviously, that heads of state are there. As we said, by the time the meeting actually happens, the political declaration and all the targets and goals that they want to get out of it will be agreed already. So I think at the meeting itself, there needs to be representation. I think there also needs to be involvement of civil society and affected communities, especially people who actually have had experience of TB themselves. Obviously, that's very important. And so I think it's important that the country delegations, which are the country groups that will actually attend the meetings, have a range of different representatives from different levels of the TB response, all the way up from, of course, the governments and the heads of state and the ministers, all the way to those frontline health workers and people who are currently on treatment for TB, people who've had TB, civil society organisations that provide TB services, etc., etc. And then after the meeting, I think one of the most important things that we're hoping to get out of this meeting is a strong accountability framework, which basically just means some kind of system decided for how everybody who works in or is interested in or is in some way involved in the TB response is able to actually hold their leaders and their governments accountable to the commitment that they made. So yeah, I think that kind of gives an overview, if that makes sense. And again, let me know if you have any questions. And also let me know if I'm speaking too fast, because I've been told I do that.
I think you're doing fine, Rosanna. No problems there. At least you're coming through quite loud and clear, at least on this line, so that is really helpful. We're going to go across to Linlithgow for question number 3.
Hello, Rosanna.
Hello.
One of old hands that have been concerned about the TB situation for a number of years. What can the UK government do to help ensure that the UN high-level meeting on TB is a success?
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much for the question, Len. Yeah, I think it's a salient question, and I think everybody in all countries should be asking what their national government can do to help make the most of it. I'm not an expert on the UK context. That's my colleagues who support the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on TB and work at the policy level with the UK government. I'll answer the question as best as I can, though. So again, firstly, if possible, of course, Theresa May should attend, and I know that there are various people working on this. I think it's also important to say that the UK has been a very strong voice on TB, and of course on antimicrobial resistance. And I think we'll probably be expected to take a leadership role among the donor countries, if you like, and be a strong voice. and a voice of expertise on working on the global TB response through the Department for International Development. And I think that this could also apply to experience around managing transition for donor withdrawal. Again, going back to the action you've been working on this month. I think as well, we know at the national level, actually, the UK has a well-developed TB response of its own for a low burden country. So obviously this was largely due, I believe, to the efforts of the UK APPG on TB, who I understand obviously had a part to play in the UK actually developing and implementing its own national TB strategy. I know that there are a lot of other low burden countries that don't have a national TB strategy, and just because you don't have high rates of TB in the country yourself, it doesn't mean that you're not really acting on it. So I think that the UK can show leadership in that context as well. I think as well the UK can help commit the place of TB within the AMR agenda. So that's within the antimicrobial resistance agenda. Sorry, I don't know. I think that probably most of you know a fair bit about AMR, but just in case. So that's infections that are resistant to drugs. So not only tuberculosis, but hospital-acquired infections like MRSA. There are HIV, malaria. Obviously, they're not hospital-acquired infections, but there's a range of different infections, obviously, that are becoming resistant to the medicine that's used to treat them. And as a whole, this is called the antimicrobial resistance is the generic term for when that happens. And TB deserves a central place in that. It currently causes about a third of deaths, I think, from drug resistance. And so you can't tackle drug resistance as a whole without addressing TB. And I think the UK has been quite a leading voice in placing TB within that agenda. And there's some important discussions coming up at the G20, which will be a few months after the high-level meeting. We're hoping that the high-level meeting can be an opportunity for the UK and other countries, other G20 countries, to demonstrate their commitment to TB in the broader health agenda. And then I think as well that there could be a push from the UK, hopefully, along with other countries, to push for a very strong accountability mechanism that includes a lot of different stakeholders, so different people working in the TB response, as I said before. I hope that answers your question. Yes, and let me know if you have any thoughts or questions.
Thanks, Rosanna. While you've been talking, the chat box has been going crazy on the right-hand side as well. I hope you've been ignoring it and just giving it.
Seen it. I'm sorry.
No, that's right. There's been a few things flying around there. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But before we do, we're going to go to our final question of this section, the prepared questions, up to Edinburgh.
Hi, it's Joanna from Edinburgh. Would you be able to give us a sense of what others are doing globally to engage their leaders on TB on this important day?
Yes, hello, Joanna and other friends in Edinburgh. I hope it's not too cold up there. So World TB Day, yes, favourite time of the year when everything just gets crazy. So what are others doing globally? I think the first thing to mention is just what the overall theme of World TB Day is this year. I think some of you probably definitely already know this, but just in case you don't, the overall theme, which has been agreed by the big TB players, including the WHO and the Stop TB Partnership, is actually in keeping with everything else we've been discussing over the past few minutes, and it's about showing political leadership. I think the strapline is "Wanted Leaders for a TB-Free World." So it's basically about finding champions who can work on TB and take it forward at high levels of government and push for some genuine political will to end the epidemic. I know that you probably, with regards to what others are doing, I know you've probably heard about the Action Partnership, which is this kind of mega confusing coalition of organisations that we work with. And they're holding a lot of different events around the various countries. I think there's, well, firstly, there's going to be a lot of media going on, opinion pieces, social media, articles, trying to get articles about TB placed wherever we can. Obviously, World TB Day is one of the, sadly, probably one of the only opportunities we really get where things get picked up on TB kind of reliably, if you like, in the year, as it's not the hottest media subject. So hopefully there'll be a big push on media and we'll be able to get some good pieces out there. As far as I understand, the other results organisations are working with their grassroots networks in the same way, obviously, that you guys will work together as the results UK grassroots network. There's some various different events going on in parliaments. So I know in the region that I work in, there's a few of the parliamentary platforms, they call them in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which are basically the equivalent of the UK APPGs, but in the Eastern European and Central Asian countries. They're called parliamentary platforms because of the translation into Russian. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. They're holding some parliamentary roundtables, inviting different stakeholders. So anybody from the parliamentarians themselves and civil society, which are obviously the usual suspects that would be there at these kind of events, but also involving making sure that other medical and technical experts are involved, so such as national TB program managers, who can sometimes be a bit neglected in these kind of events on TB that focus primarily on either civil society or political will. We need to obviously make sure we involve all of the people that are working on TB, and those technical people that manage the TB response at the country level are really also really, really important to engage. So working with them, I think there's a lot of asks relating to the high-level meeting. I think in the action countries, which span high burden and low burden countries, actually, obviously the focus from low burden countries are slightly different to the focus from high burden countries. Countries that have large rates of TB themselves, that it's going to be around the domestic response and stepping it up and making sure that their governments are committing to finding and treating all their cases, whereas in the higher income countries it's more about investing in the global response, and investing in mechanisms such as the Global Fund, etc. I think that's probably a relatively comprehensive overview of what they're doing. I don't know if Aaron has anything to add, because he's an action guru, so I'm sure he probably does.
Well, as I said, I'm off to India, and there's going to be some things going on there, and we're hopefully getting some exciting announcements out of India, which will be nice to amplify when they come. So keep your eyes open for those. Looking next week for them. I'd actually like to go across to, I'm told via the magic of text messages and so on, that we have Janneke Hauser in the Results London office. Oh, there you are, Janneke. Right, I see you. Do you want to wave? Janneke is the relatively new in post, but already incredibly experienced parliamentary advocacy officer for tuberculosis. She's been with us this whole year, I think, which is great. Janneke actually acts as the secretariat for the UK's all-party parliamentary group on TB that Rosanna mentioned earlier. There's some things going on in Parliament around this as well. And I think also, Janneke, we've had a few questions come through on the chat on the right-hand side about TB, the UK's response to TB. There's been some resources shared in there about TB in the UK, but maybe you could make a bit of that global-local link and give us some thoughts on that too.
Sure. Can everyone hear me? I can't. Yes? Yay. Hi, everyone. I saw you guys briefly at the last call, I think, when I told you about this month's set of actions. I've tried to keep an eye on the questions that have come through in the chat. There was one about whether the UK is a high-burden country. The UK had about 5,600 cases of TB last year, including around, I think it's 64 drug-resistant cases. That doesn't make the UK qualify as a high-burden country in terms of the global way that those high burden countries are categorized, but it does leave the UK with the unenviable position of having one of the highest TB burdens in Northern and Western Europe. So we see higher rates of TB and drug-resistant TB, particularly in Eastern Europe and some of the post-Soviet states, and some countries in Southern Europe also have slightly higher rates, but the UK is still up there, and there's definitely a need to do more to help those patients that are suffering from TB or who are at risk of TB in the UK. The drug resistance rates in London in particular are incredibly high. So if you look at the incidence rate, so that's the number of cases per the size of the population, in some boroughs in London, they are comparable with countries that might qualify as high burden countries. So there's definitely a lot of work to do, and particularly when you're engaging with MPs, it's worth kind of having a look at some of the statistics in their constituency to see whether you can maybe also draw on that link between the national and the global challenge that TB presents. In terms of the UK government's focus on TB and the degree to which it's able to pay attention and to really invest, I think all of you who've been working on international development advocacy towards the UK government will know the challenge that it is at the moment in the existing political climate to get any bandwidth for any sort of issue that isn't Brexit related, quite frankly. And so there's an awareness of TB in the ministry, in the Department for International Development and in the Department for Health and Social Care and all the agencies that they work with. There's lots of very, very clever people doing incredible work with great technical expertise that they want to give to the multilateral organizations and to their partners around the world. But the extent to which they're able to do that depends on how much the big bosses in their relative departments are willing to prioritize TB, whether they think it's worth their while to stick their head above the pulpit and say, I think we should give more money, or to stick their head above the pulpit and say, I think this is really important and I think we should push our partners around the world to do things on TB. And that's where you guys come in, and that's where the work of parliamentarians and the APPG and through the Global TB Caucus that Rosanna works for comes in, because the more noise we make, the braver the big bosses and the departments are to stick their head above that pulpit and to make those commitments. And so World TB Day offers a really great opportunity to kind of build that momentum and make them a little bit braver, essentially, so that we can get the change that we need to see at the UN high-level meeting. I hope I've answered all those questions. I know that I've rambled.
That's great. Thanks, Yannicka. I'm going to go over to some additional questions that have come in via text message. We're down to 10 minutes, so we want to stay really focused to get through as much as we can. I've got one from Tom in Brighton who asks, what can the UK government do to speed up the development of new antibiotics, which can lower the cost and duration of treatment? And simultaneously, we'll do a couple at once. Do we expect all the heads of state to attend the high-level meeting? Who's confirmed? What does it look like? How much hard work do we think is going to be needed? Rosanna, I think that's one for you. That's from Sanjay in Macclesfield.
Hi, Sanjay, and also Tom. Maybe if we do the HLM one first and then we move on to the antibiotics, because I can try and answer that as well, and maybe Yannicka and possibly Aaron will have something to add. With the head of states and the HLM, I think the answer is unfortunately quite simple. We just don't really know yet. It's obviously a few months down the line that it's happening. It's not happening till the end of September. Obviously, we're in the beginning of March, and as you can imagine, heads of state and their schedules can be a bit tricky to pin down. Obviously, it's important as many heads of state attend as possible, and we hope that especially countries that have very high rates or high burdens of TB themselves, that there will be some high level representation as i.e. the heads of government, will be there from those countries. But honestly, the question is, it's just too early to say. I think it will be interesting down a bit further down the line when hopefully heads of state do start confirming publicly to attend, whether that they encourage each other. But to be honest, I mean, the TB community hasn't experienced a high-level meeting before, so it's an interesting process for us to be witnessing as well. With regards to Tom's question and what the UK can do to help the development of new antibiotics for TB, I think that's a really important question, and it has it's a bit of a tricky answer. I think the UK has already shown, as we were talking about before, a lot of leadership on antimicrobial resistance, which is obviously drug resistance, which is very applicable to TB. And of course, we need new antibiotics for TB. We've only had 2 new drugs come through in the last 50 years or so for the disease, which is shocking, the age of the antibiotics that we're using to treat TB. So I think the UK made a big step in helping push forward the commitment of the G20 to antimicrobial resistance and to addressing it. There are kind of with regards to global opportunities to invest in TB R&D, kind of coordinated platforms such as that, which might come from the G20, seem to be quite difficult to set up. And I think just the UK government actually just investing in TB R&D in general would be an answer there. It remains to be seen whether coordinated efforts from countries across the G20 to try and ramp up the investment in TB R&D and really get that going, because it's obviously lacking. We don't have the right tools that we need. Remains to be seen, and we'll be trying to work on that this year and obviously in years to come. I don't know if Janneke or Aaron, you have anything else to add to those questions.
Right, sorry for hunting for the mute button. No, I think that was a very comprehensive answer there. I've got a question that's come in also from Sanjay, because he's very prolific. He's asked, will there be things we can share on Facebook sent from the office that we can cut and paste and share? I was just actually typing into the chat box a link to the campaign materials, which are public, but again, we'd ask, we don't really, the campaign on this publicly for World TB Day kicks off on the 19th of March. So we'll share you the link now so you can get all ready, but please don't start spamming out loads of messages to everybody for a couple of weeks' time. We may send around something a bit close to the time to remind you to hit go on all of that. But I will just put the link to a bunch of campaign materials in the chat box. In the last 5 minutes, I will go out to the broader conference call, particularly priority to people that are on the telephones. If you have a question for Rosanna or even for Janneke or myself or anybody, do take yourself off mute and yell it out now. Right, great.
There's lots of unanswered questions in the chat box, Aaron. There's one I noticed for a long time back about Vladimir Putin.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay, so I actually have a very...
Do you think Putin is an unlikely ally at the UN high-level meeting? And that's from Norwich.
Yeah, so if I tell you what, I'll give an answer based on my personal experience, Rosanna, and then maybe you can give a more professional answer based on your knowledge of the region and any interactions you've had with Russia recently. I was actually in Moscow last year for the high-level meeting, no, not the high-level meeting, sorry, the ministerial meeting in Russia, for which I also put a link in the chat box around that. I was in the room when Vladimir Putin took the stage. They locked the doors. It was rather disconcerting. But rather than saying, welcome to Moscow, have a good conference, he actually stood up and spoke for a solid 5 to 10 minutes, actually about TB. He called it as serious to the Russian government as cancer, which is about, and heart disease, which is about as good as you can get. And in talking to some of my allies and colleagues across the region that were in the room, they were quite frankly a bit astonished that he gave real political capital to that, and they actually were saying at that stage back in November, this is going to give us some additional momentum on TB in the region, because what he talks about people around here listen to, which I thought was pretty good, really. I don't have much of an update past that. I don't know, Rosanna, do you want to weigh in with any more recent intelligence? Certainly, having Vladimir Putin is a bit of a good thing.
My internet dropped, so I missed the question, but I presume it was what's Russia's role in all of this?
It was. Do we think that Vladimir Putin is going to be an unlikely ally at the UNHLM and help form a global cohort of leaders?
Well, yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I think. Obviously, Russia hosted the ministerial conference last year, and we hope that Russia will follow through on this and these commitments. Within the region, Russia is basically the biggest hindrance in TB rates dropping in the region. We've found it quite hard to engage with Russia so far. We've managed to engage pretty well with a lot of its post-Soviet neighbours, and we're seeing a lot of parliamentary action on tuberculosis in neighbouring countries. So in those post-Soviet states, which are the ones that have the highest rates of MDR-TB, along with Russia. So Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc. I think one thing which is quite important to note as well is that the Russian national TB program manager is now the head of the WHO global TB program, so she leads on TB for the WHO, and we're hoping that will help in encouraging Russia and Mr. Putin to take increased action. It remains to be seen, but I hope the answer is yes.
Keep on hunting for that unmute button. I agree, and I think we've certainly seen some really interesting noises coming out of the BRICS countries in terms of some of the things that they're pulling together, given the amount of disease burden in the BRICS countries. For those that don't know what those are, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Huge burden, huge potential to make drugs, do research and development, treat people. Just within those BRICS countries, and Russia's a key player there, despite some of the challenges that it does experience itself. Naveed, it looked like you were going to jump in.
I just been going up and down the chat box for remaining questions, and there's one. We've got about a minute, but a question from Peter: is the barrier to vaccine development more social or technical? I have no idea if it's even possible to answer that in a minute, but would maybe Rosanna or you be able to have a go on that?
I know we have only 1 minute. I'd probably say I think it's technically quite difficult, but obviously there's social barriers as well. I don't know if anyone else wants to say.
I mean, my take on that one is the biggest barrier to the vaccine development and research and development on TB is technical. But the fact of the matter is, and this is the kicker, if we had the money we needed to do the research that we need, then we would discover that those technical barriers start to melt away fairly rapidly. There's a couple of very good reports on tuberculosis research and development funding, one put out by an organization called TAG, Treatment Action Group, that really highlights the huge gaps we've got on research and development funding. One of the asks that's very likely to be made at the high-level meeting is for donor governments, even middle-income countries, to dramatically increase funding on research and development for TB. We're still using tools that are well over 100 years old. The existing TB vaccine is going to have its 100th birthday before too long. It's frankly disgraceful, is the only word to describe it. Despite lots of really good researchers doing really good work and trying it absolutely as best they can. We saw what happened when you poured billions and billions and billions of dollars into research and development with HIV. And we've got some amazing treatments for HIV that many people thought were utterly impossible to create. We absolutely need that same level of attention and on TB R&D. And so the money will help us bust through the technical barriers at great speed.
Peter, if you're super interested in TB vaccines research, you might want to have a look at a website from an initiative called the TB Vaccines Initiative, TBVI. They collate and coordinate all the research groups that are working on TB vaccines research. And they have some great resources to kind of give you a sense of where we're at with the research and development now and what more money could let us do, because that's essentially what it comes down to at the minute.
That's great. Thank you very much.
So,
TBVI.
Yeah.
TBVI, yeah.
I can drop a link into the chat, maybe.
I'll do that now.
Work it out.
I've got it.
Wow, you're on it. You're on it, Pete. Well, look, I'm very sorry. There are a couple of unanswered questions in the chat, and I know we could probably talk all night, but I do want to be very respectful of people's time. That's one of the things we really try and do in results. We're a couple of minutes over. So unless anybody has an absolutely deadly burning question that they want to ask any of our speakers this evening, I will call the meeting to a close. And let me just get my notes up about how we're going to close the meeting. Right. Okay. Oh, that's good. Right. So, look, I just want to say a really, really big thank you to Yannicka for jumping into the breach, but most of all to Rosanna for really anchoring the whole call through what's really happening in the world and around the region, and really giving us a feel for how these really quite complicated international and truly international between different countries events take shape. I think I certainly, it was great to hear you talk about specifically what the UK can do and how it's really so important that a country that has, amongst developed countries, a fairly high TB burden ourselves, a country that has a long history of engagement with TB, certainly a country that has massive research and development resources with excellent universities and pharmaceutical companies here are really exploring this issue and moving that forward as well. We've got a lot to offer there. So thanks for highlighting all of that to the people on the call. I am going to call the meeting to a close. By joining us this evening, really thank you so much to everybody. Do take the action this month. We've given you tons of resources. There's loads to digest there. But remember, the core of what we're about is actually pretty simple. It doesn't need to be complicated because what we're about is stopping people dying from an incredibly preventable, curable disease that frankly costs next to nothing to cure if you catch it early. And the fact that we're still having well over 1 million people die of this disease every year is something that we can fix and that we will fix if we can get the political will. So look, any unanswered questions, do get a hold of the office. We're very happy to help pick those up and of course help you with any of your actions, anything that you need doing, advice, support, whatever. So thank you very much. Good luck, and we will see you all again soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Good
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
I had a burning question, but it didn't come up till right at the end of the meeting.